Okay, everyone, good evening. Just waiting till everyone's seated. Thank you for your patience. Welcome to everybody. That's welcome to those that are here. And I should acknowledge that amongst those that are here, there is, as usual, members of the London Transport Museum friends, but we're also host to guests from the Omnibus Society tonight. So welcome to Omnibus Society members as well. And to those who are watching live, possibly on YouTube at the moment, and those who may watch later on YouTube too. Just the usual quick announcement about the ground arrangements here. If the alarms go off, we hope they won't, it will be a real alarm situation. Just follow the instructions from the museum staff who are here tonight and exit through the doors behind you and behind me here with the green signs. And please make certain your mobile phones are switched off. If I could test the patience of our YouTube viewers, particularly those who may be viewing later, I will just get the parish notices out of the way because they're fairly brief. We have only one more meeting now before we have a break for Christmas, although in practice that is actually two meetings. 3 weeks, I think it is, from tonight on the 5th of December. We will have the Friends annual members meeting at 5:30. That's a little earlier than we announced in the last Friends news, but we thought the timetable was getting a bit tight. So we're going to start the annual members meeting at 5:30, and that will be followed at 6:30 by a talk by John Willis, who has recently written a book on the railways of Docklands. That is the subject of his talk, and John will be signing copies of the book should you be minded to buy one ahead of that meeting, probably up in the shop upstairs with your 20% discount, of course, if you're a member of the Friends. So just have those times in your mind: 5:30 if you're coming to the annual members meeting, 6:30 if you're coming to John's talk. Hopefully you'll come to both. We will regard those meetings as two separate meetings on the website, so if you're coming to both, would you please book for both? And that's the end of the parish notices. So, to our speaker tonight, who absolutely has no need of introduction in this theatre, it is Sam Mullins, the director of the London Transport Museum, but he's off his usual ground as far as we're concerned. He's not talking about the London Transport Museum and its wondrous works, but Sam has an interest in a period of history which is perhaps a little earlier than some of our usual talks, and that is the country carrier, those who started rural bus and transport services before the motor bus arrived in the period roughly from 1850 to 1920. And those are the years, not the time of Sam's talk, though he may coincidentally finish around about 1920. We'll see. But that's enough from me. Sam, the floor is yours.
I will do.
Are you banked up? Mic'd up?
I will just turn it on. Right, that's better. Thank you. Thank you, Barry. Yes, it's a novelty to be here, not asking you for your support for the museum or telling you something wondrous that we've been done recently. Instead, I'm going to share with you a sort of research enthusiasm of mine that's gone on for some time, and which I hope will be kind of slightly new territory for you in a number of respects. The carrier's van was kind of ubiquitous in setting up particularly market town transport networks from the early 19th century. It then morphed in a kind of wonderful kind of pioneering period with the advent of motorised chassis and the beginnings of the bus around about the First World War and just afterwards into that sort of pioneering era of motor buses. And we'll leave off that story as Wilts and Dorset hoover up all the local services, because we're going to be mostly in South Wilts this evening, looking at a kind of case study of country carriers and their function in the era before. the motor bus. And why are we in Salisbury, you ask yourself? Well, it's my hometown. I was brought up in Salisbury. I went to Bishop Wordsworth Grammar School. And the other lecture I do on Salisbury is 4 Generations of Antique Dealers, based on my great-grandfather's premises, which some of you may later remember as Beech's Bookshop on the High Street, just before you go through the High Street gate into the cathedral. So I was brought up in Salisbury. I travelled to school from the age of 6 on a Wilts and Dorset bus. I remember catching the bus in the marketplace, which we're going to look at in a kind of earlier era. I've even collected a bit of memorabilia since. I've got the bus blind on the bus that I travelled to school on. And of course, some of you in the audience will know far more about the interesting story of Shergold's Silver Star buses from Salisbury to Portland Down, of which that'll have to be a lecture another day. So we're in South Wiltshire. Salisbury's geography is very much based on having Cranbourne Chase to the south and Salisbury Plain to the north, and most of the population are in the river valleys leading, the 5 different river valleys that lead into the Avon at Salisbury. And it's up and down those valleys that our country carriers were operating. Salisbury has been a market town since it was laid out in the 13th century. It's a new town, a new medieval town. This is a rather kind of knocked about, but very early photograph of the market, thought to be maybe from the 1850s, which looks pretty kind of chaotic. Livestock kind of all over the place, wagons, people, a few stalls, but in the background, in front of the shops, you'll see a couple of tilted vans with canvas tilts on, which I think are carriers from that date. But a better jumping off point is the market square in round about 1904 from this fabulous postcard. This is the medieval marketplace as laid out in the 13th century. You can see the vans that have come in from the country villages on that map from a range of perhaps 10, 15, 18 miles away, the mercurial speed of 3.5 or 4 miles an hour into the market, particularly on Tuesdays and Saturdays, which were market days in Salisbury. They've lined up on the edge of the market square. The horses have been taken into the inns around the edge. And the carriers are off doing their business in town, and it's that which we're going to explore. So my thesis really is that country carriers and their vans and carts were such a commonplace feature of the rural scene, and particularly market towns rather than industrial towns before the Great War, that they've almost been forgotten. They leave very little documentary trace other than the occasional battered notebook and the directory lists in Kelly's directories and so forth. They weren't licensed, they were just common carriers, and they generally plied their carrying trade as a by-employment to minding the village shop or the pub, working the smithy or a wheelwright. And few records really remain to testify to their significance. And yet, carriers' carts and country people streamed into market towns such as Salisbury with very much as much a characteristic of Victorian England as the industrial cities and the overcrowded slums that we're very kind of familiar with. Now, by the early 19th century, many smaller markets in villages had ebbed away, and with a growing number of manufactured goods, country people became more and more reliant on urban markets for packeted goods, manufactured things, and a visit to the market town at anything up to 20 or 25 miles distance wasn't only important for the purchase of these goods, unobtainable in the village shop or regular tinkers and peddlers, but also for the sale of produce from allotments and small holdings. And by the mid-19th century, carriers left most of the medium and larger villages in the valleys of South Wiltshire on market days to take their small cargo of women and old men with baskets of vegetables, strings of rabbits and poultry and dairy produce, all bound for Salisbury. And let me just find my... And there's a really nice account of Salisbury and the kind of carrier's trip in W.H. Hudson's book, A Shepherd's Life, which is a wonderful book written as a sort of as fiction, but from lots of oral history accounts, and published in 1910. I quote, "So to say, for instance, that I'm going to Salisbury tomorrow and catch the gleam in the children's eye and watch them furtively watching me, whisper to one another that there will be something for them on the morrow too. To set out betimes and overtake the early carriers' carts on the road, each with its little cargo of packages and women with baskets and an old man or two, to recognise acquaintances amongst those who sit in front, as I go on overtaking and passing the carriers and the little general dealer in his dirty ramshackle cart, drawn by a rough, fast-trotting pony, all of us intent on business and pleasure, bound for Salisbury, the great market and emporium, and place of all delights for the great plain." Let's move on a little. Oh, I'm just repeating that one. I think we've got a... Yeah. So you can look at carriers' networks through the trade directories, Kelly's, Piggott's and so forth, most of the way through the 19th century. And you can begin to kind of pull out from them the kind of sphere of influence of market towns. In Wiltshire, for example, Salisbury has quite a big area of influence, as does Devizes, much smaller town. Salisbury's about 21,000 population, Devizes a third of that. Swindon, much, much bigger, is an industrial town, new railway town, and so there isn't anything like the network of carriers into Swindon. But the directories all have these little lists in them. So essentially what the directory is telling you, if you wanted to get something delivered to a resident in Broad Chalk, for example, which is halfway down the list, you need to go to the Chuff Inn on the marketplace on either a Tuesday, a Thursday or a Saturday, when the carrier would depart at 4 o'clock for Broad Chalk. Or you could go and talk to Mr. Isaacs at the Round of Beef, which is just around the corner, and he did just 2 days into town. So this is a really great source for beginning to understand the kind of sphere of influence of market towns in the 19th century. And then if you map out, this is a map for Salisbury in 1865. The thickness of the lines suggests how dense the services were, and you can see quite a lot going up to Amesbury, which of course is the route of the first Wilts-and-Dorset bus service in 1914, out to Wilton and to the west and up onto the plain. And this is a sunny Tuesday or a Saturday in Salisbury Market. At this date, these markets are very much around the sale of livestock and produce still. Stall markets for kind of hardware and so forth come much later and into the 20th century. This is, I think this is William Wallace, the auctioneer, who's selling sheep and livestock. There are cattle kind of behind to a lot of country people. Let's do that one. My first acquaintance with the role of the carrier actually was when I was doing A levels. We did Thomas Hardy's Woodlanders, and very early in the book is an account of Mrs. Dollory's van. I won't give you the whole story of the Woodlanders, but you remember that one of the key moments is the barber from Shaftesbury going out to an obscure country village to persuade a poor young woman to part with her hair, which he wants to make into a wig, red hair, I have to stress. And he gets lost out in the country, and eventually, presently, a slight noise of labouring wheels and the steady dig of a horse's shoe tips became audible, and there loomed in the notch of sky and plantation a carrier's van drawn by a single horse. The vehicle was half full of passengers, mostly women. He held up his stick at its approach, and the woman who was driving drew rein. He asks directions. He gets up next to her, and she takes him to Little Hintock, where he's looking for Marty South. This is the book where Marty South's father is ill upstairs, convinced the tree is going to fall and demolish his cottage, and when some kind person does come to demolish the tree, he dies. Hardy was always, ever the optimist. He mounted and sat beside her with his feet outwards, where they were ever and anon brushed by the horse's tail. The old horse, whose hair was of the roughness and colour of heather, whose leg joints, shoulders and hoofs were distorted by harness and drudgery from colthood, had trodden this road almost daily for 20 years. Even his subjection was not made congruous throughout, for the harness being too short, his tail wasn't drawn through the crupper, and the breeching slipped awkwardly to one side. The vehicle had a square black tilt which nodded with the motion of the wheels, and at a point in it over the driver's head was a hook over which the reins were hitched. Mrs. Dollery, having to hop up and down many times in the service of her passengers, wore in windy weather short leggings under her gown for modesty's sake, and instead of a bonnet, a felt hat tied down with a handkerchief. In the rear of the van was a glass window, which she cleaned with a pocket handkerchief every market day before starting. The passengers in the back formed a group to themselves, and while the newcomer spoke to the proprietress, they indulged in a confidential chat about him, while the noise of the van rendered inaudible to himself and Mrs. Dollery sitting forward. Anyway, that's Mrs. Dollery's van. My first encounter with the carrier. There's a nice quote from a Sussex carrier in the 1880s. The carrier also performed a valuable service for those unable or without need enough to go up to town. And on the outskirts of the village, womenfolk waited patiently at the roadside for us. Clad in skirts to the ground and heavy black boots, the women handed up scraps of paper listing their wants from Lewis, parcels for delivery, or more rabbits for sale. Many who couldn't write whispered their needs to my father, who wrote them in a small black book. So the village carrier was, both an omnibus and a shopping agent. He, but occasionally she, was also the means by which parcels and goods were dispatched from the nearest railway station or the town to country destinations. The 19th century directories, as I've said, are a mine of information and the only systematic account of these networks. Now, the long-distance carriers, wagons, of course, are going out of service during the 1830s and 40s as the railways begin to soak up much more of the long-distance traffic. The railways actually have a reverse effect on the country carriers, and the local networks, particularly acting as kind of feeders to railways, actually grow during the course of the 19th century. So far from being eclipsed by the railway, they were feeders of the new network. In South Wilts, the carrier's network of services extended over a wide area, radius of about 25 miles or so, from Warminster and the windy wastes of Tillshead and the villages nestling in the plain to the lush valleys of Kingsomborne and Stockbridge, and from Enford and Pewsey down the Avon to Ringwood and into Cranbourne Chase. And of course the railways, even at their greatest extent, never directly served more than a small proportion of rural settlements. So, Slater's Directory of 1850 suggested into Salisbury there were 114 carriers operating 213 services each week, and by 1889 this had grown to 112 operating 246 services. But by 1911 this has declined to 78 carriers and 178 services, probably to do with the depressed nature of the county in the late 19th century. It's one of the poorest rural counties in the country, but also perhaps the direct competition of railways. And certainly Hudson in the Shepherd's Life, which I've just referred to, speaks of hundreds and hundreds of more people coming by train on market days in 1910. You see them pouring down Fisherton Street in a continuous procession, all hurrying marketwards. The carriers usually base themselves in, as we've seen in the directory entries, in inns, particularly close to the marketplace. The little engraving on the left is what was called the Cornish Chough, or the Chough Inn, still there today. I think something like 20% of the carriers used the Chough as their base. And by base, it means this is where you could drop off parcels for the carrier, but they also fed and watered the horses, or the horse, while the carrier went around and did his business during the day. And then the wagon and horses on the left is another carrier's inn in Fisherton Street. As I said, the railway, of course, had arrived, London South Western had arrived long ago as 1859 in Salisbury. The Great Western had a separate station, which is actually just on the right of that right-hand photograph from 1856. And just coming round this curve is a London South Western express to Waterloo. This is the point at which the famous, or the terrible railway accident in 1906 took place, when the Atlantic Mail failed to stop coming through the station and came off the rails with large loss of life just at this sharp point. Every train subsequent to that has been obliged to stop in the station before restarting. Let's just move through. I think we've seen that one. You'll notice actually in this kind of enlarged, all sorts of different vehicles, all shapes and sizes. Some of them kind of proper vans with even the name of the proprietor on the side, Harold Ayres from Amesbury, who eventually becomes a bus operator. Some two-wheel vehicles, some simple carts with canvas tilts over the top. They came in all shapes and sizes. It was possible to buy a purpose-built carrier's van. This is from the catalogue of late 19th century catalogue of Bristol Wagon and Carriage Company. As you can see, this has got a sort of canvas tilt over the top of a four-wheel body. When you're talking about country carriers, particularly in Salisbury, one always gets drawn to Mrs. Rideout and the inaptly named Coombe Express. The Kelly's Directory for 1880 lists under the Salisbury carriers Mrs. Rideout, who left the haunch of venison every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday at 3 p.m. for Coombe Bissett and Homington, where she kept the shop. Now, Frank Brooks, an artist, recorded the Coombe Express, which you see here in full pitch, in sketches and oils in the 1870s. And he related that he would meet her at Harnham Bridge when she was leaving the town, as she always made a stop at the old and picturesque inn called the Swan for a last refresher for herself and the donkeys, generally, I think, from the same jug. I often walked with her to Coombe, and the pace was such that at times I was able to walk backwards and draw, hence the name she was so well known by. Now, she's quite unusual in that she's a female carrier, but there are other women. Mrs. Roberts worked a cart from the White Horse to Durrington, and another from the Woolpack, Sarah Williams, in 1889. But generally, the carriers were men. Her donkey cart is a little bit of an oddity, at the kind of lower end of the vehicle spectrum. and not a lot of room for passengers or goods, one suspects, but there you are. It's a lovely kind of piece of slightly kind of romanticised view of the carrier, and this is another of the drawings that our man took of Mrs. Dollery. And while I was actually looking for some illustration for this talk, I came across this picture. This is actually Ayleswade Bridge, Harnham Bridge, with cathedral spire behind, and there are two donkey carts actually in the background. Have just come over the bridge, and I wonder whether one of them is Mrs. Dollery or not. So if we have a look at some of the horse-drawn carriers, this is Josiah Williams, the Bowerchalk postmaster and carrier, who went in 3 days a week to the Chuff. He left 9:30 in the morning from Bowerchalk, which must be at least 8 miles into town, and arrived at 1 o'clock, and then departed home at 4 that afternoon. And you can see he's got a couple of passengers, and the horse certainly looks like it's done the trip on more than one occasion. This is a Leicestershire carrier, the Shepshed carrier. I put this one in because this is quite a common, another common type of vehicle, more of a kind of farm cart with a canvas tilt over the top than a purpose-built van. This is Mark Thurman, the Shepshed carrier, in about 1900, and there is I believe a carrier's wagon like this is in the collections of Leicestershire or Leicester museums. This is another carrier, a bit more sophisticated van. This is in 1874 near Banbury at Sibford Ferris, Oxfordshire. And I think you get that nice impression that, as we talked about, these are women off to market with some kind of market produce. I think you might have lost a turnip out of that basket in the foreground. You can see that the carrier's job is a serious business, and you can see that how they've got the reins from the horse hooked up over the top, as in Mrs. Dollery's van. And I presume these are country women off to the market to sell their produce. Another bit more sophisticated. This is a Bonner of Abingdon, who was also a proprietor of refreshment rooms in the town, about 1900. Outside his rooms, and then a Burfield carrier going into Reading, H. Thomas. So you can see that vehicles are sort of many and varied. And then we're back to a couple of Salisbury carriers finally. On the left, the Cranbourne carrier, James Coburn, actually in 1925, coming over Ayleswade Bridge in Harnham. It's interesting. You can just see a motor bus in the far background, which he's about to succumb to, I suspect, as horse-drawn carriage was becoming less and less frequent sight. But he's got a kind of pretty basic two-wheel farm cart with a tilt over the top. And then on the right-hand side, this is the Porton carrier, William Selway, and his son. Often had to take the boy with him to do a lot of jumping up and down and collecting the orders and so forth when they arrived to town. This is a picture from 1907. The other thing that quite interests me about this one is you can see that the road surface is incredibly rough, and that the stones are all kind of stuck to the edge of the wheels. The kind of surface which had to be improved when motor buses became more the rule. And this is a wonderfully grainy Lincolnshire carrier. Again, pretty basic farm cart, probably taking produce into market. Carrier's life wasn't necessarily a bed of roses. This is an accident taking place where on a steep hill outside Grantham, a carrier's van had got away, and I believe there was loss of life. And you can see the van in the middle is pretty wrecked. And then even, it wasn't a bed of roses in Salisbury marketplace either. This is the great blizzard of April the 25th, 1908. You can see the vans, some of them have set off home already, but some still to go in pretty bleak conditions. So once arrived in town, the carrier's passengers scattered on their many errands and calls, while the carrier himself watered and stabled the horse at his usual inn or station, as they were called. The vans were parked round the edge, much as here, joining the beasts tied up to the wooden railings, the calves with great eyes of terror straining at their ropes, the sheep and pigs penned within hurdles. The rows of vans drawn up next to the stalls and the cheapjack and the drovers in their dirty linen coats. They might need running repairs, so James Quinton, the wheelwright of Penny Farthing Street in the 20s, recalled many a time going down to the marketplace where country carriers used to come with their vans and take the wheel off on a Tuesday or a Saturday at the market while they was there, and then put them back on again and jack up the van before they went home. The carrier or his boy, having seen to the horse, delivered the parcels and shopping orders to be collected later and then repaired to the inn for refreshment. There were 65 pubs in Salisbury in 1889 around the centre of the city. The carriers used only 13 of them, and of these a kind of dominant caucus of three, the Chuff, the Woolpack and the Shoulder of Mutton, accounted for half of the city's carrying trade, and proximity to the market square itself was obviously important. Let's move on. The carrier was typically a jack of all trades, his ownership of a cart or a van opening up all sorts of other sources of work. Of the 112 operating into Salisbury in 1889, the occupation of 73 of them we can find out, and many of them have a principal occupation other than carrying. Shopkeepers, innkeepers, farmers, blacksmiths, wheelwrights, coal dealer, and even registrars of birth, marriages and deaths. For many of these occupations, the regular carriage of supplies and materials from the nearest town necessitated owning a cart or a van, and carrier services followed kind of quite easily from this work. So let's begin to let's just kind of finish on the role of the horse-drawn carrier. How are we doing for time, Barry? I think I did promise I'd finish this in under 3 hours for Barry. So, I think it's easy to forget how isolated country districts were in the 19th century and even into the earlier 20th century. And the carrier was often a source of commercial and social gossip, news of the wider world, and hard news. The muffled conversation under the square canvas tilt of Mrs. Dollery's van is witness to the spreading of news. As independent men, they often seem to have gained a singular reputation. The Sussex carrier who touched his cap to no man and so made many enemies. A Swindon milliner's wife was the victim of a wusset, the traditional communal censure for conjugal infidelity in Wiltshire. People had apparently become suspicious of her over-frequent trips to Bath with the carrier. And then more typically, in Juniper Hill, Oxfordshire, Flora Thompson's Lark Rise, the carrier typically took the young girl's yellow trunk to the railway station on the first leg of her journey into domestic service, and at the later stage of life, it was the carrier who helped take the major away to the workhouse. So let's begin to kind of look at the transition, the impact of motorisation on the horse-drawn carrier. And it's got very strong parallels with the very rapid departure of the horse bus in London, for example. You can see on the left a marvellous photograph of a kind of carrier's van with loads of stuff kind of loaded up on it, on the roof and on the kind of drop-down tailboard at the back. We've got this quite nice example of Percy Pearce, who was a carrier who worked from Bulford Camp before the First World War, 3 times a week, calling at Bulford Village, Durrington and Amesbury, and then into Salisbury. That's the top pictures pre-1914. And then during the First World War, he started operating 2 Model T Fords this kind of body. You can't quite probably see it, but it does say Salisbury, Amesbury, and Bulford written on the side there. Thomas Lee from Winterbourne Gunner, a bit of a dark picture, this one, but I put it in because it kind of marks that transition. He motorised in 1920, and eventually his widow ended up running the Winterbourne and Gomeldon motor bus services. Now it's worth just taking a little kind of peroration while we're here, because Salisbury also had its own car company, Scout Motors. The Burden brothers in Salisbury were originally essentially turret clock makers. Made the turret clocks for church towers around the area. But Albert Burden was something of a technical genius, an innovator. They got into turn of the century into engines for marine application, for boats. They started making Scout cars from 1904, which I think 2 survive. And then built a new factory in Churchfield in 1907, got into small light vans, and then buses in 1912, built in Salisbury, and typically having a chain-driven rear axle as the one on the right. And this is the first Wilts and Dorset Motor Services bus, which started running from Amesbury to Salisbury on a regular service in 1914, using a Scout bus. And then one of the cars on the left, I think Salisbury Museum acquired one of the Scout cars. The company had a hard time during the First World War. Its buses weren't requisitioned because they were so unlike the other type, the kind of mass types that were requisitioned. But there was by the end of the war, they'd been doing a lot of war work, and the equipment was wiped out. And when reinvestment was needed, like a lot of small companies, they went to the wall in 1921. But they did run these rather elegant single-deck buses. This is a company called Halls of Orkeston, which is just up in Salisbury Plain, sort of on the way to Imber, who ran 2 Scout buses in 1919 into Devizes on Devizes Market Day, and into Salisbury on Salisbury Market Day. And here's another one of the Shrewton buses. This was the bus delivered in 1915 to Hall and Sons, Shrewton Motor Services, and one of the later tickets. So what's interesting here is that some are embracing motorisation and moving in the direction of very familiar kind of regular bus service. Others aren't. I just love these pictures of people sitting on the roof, and you do wonder, don't you, what happens under low trees, or a bridge, or if it rains. But this is another Scout bus. This was driven in from Sixpenny Hanley, so named after a famous labourers' strike in the early 19th century. This is another chain-driven Scout at Salisbury railway station. And I think we'll see on some other pictures there is usually a ladder attached to the other side of the bus on which you got to the upper seats. And there's the ladder. This is the Winterslow bus. This is a Dennis kind of purpose-built carrier's van, sort of carrier's bus. So it's a sort of hybrid somewhere between a bus and a carrier's van. You can see again it's got it's got plenty of space on the back for loading up things to take home, and this is Edward Knight's bus, who's standing proudly by the front wheel there, on a whole series of photographs taken in and around the marketplace in March 1921. This is a 1917 28 horsepower Dennis carrier's van with the seats on the roof. And here they are in use again. This is Edwin Cave's Upavon Motor Services, up the Avon north from Salisbury, another chain-driven Scout. The company was sold on in 1927 and then becomes part of Wilson Dorset in 1932 as the small operators were gradually hoovered up into more entrepreneurial bus companies. Oh, I think we've seen that one already. I'll just test you on that one later. This one I rather enjoy. This is a photograph in the marketplace in 1921, which has an interesting selection, extraordinary selection of mixed vehicles, but it does actually also still have a horse-drawn van in the middle. There's a great... The young man from Motor Traction arrives in... Motor Traction magazine arrives in Salisbury in March 21, and I wonder whether these photographs are part of that. He was very critical and of the apparent lack of business acumen in the Salisbury carrying business. He said, anyone desirous of gathering first-hand information as to the use of motor vehicles by country carriers is recommended to pay a visit to Salisbury any day of the week, but preferably Tuesday, which is a market day. Salisbury is a market centre for a very large number of villages within a radius of 20 miles, and in the majority of cases the only means of conveyance is provided by the local carrier, who has forsaken the horse for the motor. The result is that on Tuesdays the marketplace is choked full with country carriers' motor vehicles. The cars convey both passengers and goods, which consist almost entirely of market stock to and from Salisbury. They are the most weird collection of road transport machines you could see anywhere, with bodywork ranging from the makeshift to accommodate about 12 people, and some goods to those designed with some regard for the job for which they were used. He noticed that some carried goods on glorified luggage grids on the back, others on top, and others inside. He found that most of the carriers, practically all of them owner-drivers, ran into Salisbury 3 or 4 times a week. Otherwise, apart from the odd job, the vehicles were idle. Worse, he thought, was that on those days that they were used, they remained standing in Salisbury between 10 and 4, with the effect that the average country carrier's car in Salisbury district does not do more than about 24 running hours work a week. This brave young man from London then advised several of these doughty moonrakers, that's how they're described in his article, that they should better use their time between the arrival and departure by running some passenger carrying services around the city. The unanimous response was that their customers had long used the vehicles as accumulative repositories for the items purchased piecemeal and considered this part of the service, so they had to remain in the marketplace. He then took a last swipe at the miscellaneous junk heap of motor transport in Salisbury, concluding that what the carriers in the Salisbury area should do is to combine and scrap the dead machines and get an experienced transport in the end to organise a carrier's business on paying lines. If not, they may find some enterprising firm come along and take all their trade away, which, of course, Wilson Dorset was eventually to do. So here you have a little line-up. There's the Royal Red from Shaftesbury on the left. This rather fine Rangers motor service from Durrington that even had electric light inside it. This is an all-day and onions saloon bus. Then Sainsbury's of Shrewton, Knight of Winterslow, White of Netheravon, Parsons horse-drawn bus from Winterslow, and then later this is there's an ex-LGOC chassis with a bus body on it here, which we'll see something of later. And a similar view, similar date. Again, an extraordinary range of vehicles. There's a let's get this right. There's a Crossley Charabanc there. What comes next? The Royal Red AEC Shara. Rawlings, we ran from Hindon out to Hindon and East Noyle. A Speedwell operated by Morgan from Broughton. Another Dennis saloon bus. Edward Cave's Upavon Dennis Saloon. And then an Austin, an AEC and a Scout operated by Halls of Orchiston, which we've seen already just on the end. So this is what the man from Motor Traction saw and wondered about. Some of the carriers carried on essentially doing their carrier's trade. This is Walter Sainsbury's Willys carrier's van in the marketplace in 1921, and you can see it's very much about carrying parcels and goods out to the country districts, rather than it being anything like a bus. On the other hand, other operators began to think that a bus as such might be their solution. This was actually operated by a farmer, Robert Williamson of Knoll Farm, Bowerchalk, out in the Chalk Valley. This is a 1911 Scout, and he used it to carry milk, cereal and watercress to market, and also made use of the roof seats, as you can see. There's the ladder on the side of the bus just to give you easy access to the top. And another nice early picture, another Scout bus. This is 1913. This was the first motor bus in Mere, which is out to the west of Salisbury, west of Hindon, which started a regular service into the market. And I think actually we've seen that one already. That's Halls of Orchiston. The other dynamic going on here, which is worth just remembering, is that from before the First World War, particularly during and then afterwards, the huge presence of the military on Salisbury Plain, and a lot of the early bus as opposed to carriers services find themselves serving the needs of all these soldiers garrisoned out on Salisbury Plain, who clearly wanted to get into Salisbury for a good time, good night out on the weekend. Here's a rather marvellous. This is Mark Ranger of Durrington again, the man who had that rather fine All Days and Onion saloon bus. He's got a Thornycroft char-a-banc, which he ran excursions into town for troops based on the plain. You can see it's quite kind of organised. It's got his sign up on the windscreen and so forth. When I was a boy, it was on Saturday night. The pub next to the bus station was the scene of enormous fights at closing time. People thrown through the windows on a regular basis before the last bus went back to Salisbury Plain. And as our man from Motor Traction noted, there were some very odd vehicles around on the Salisbury service. On the left is Frank Newman's Red Lynch and Downton service, which is actually a Daimler private car which had been fitted with a body from a larger vehicle. It doesn't look a very good fit to me. And if you put the brakes on at all hard, one suspected that the two might part company. And then the other one here is the Winterslow carrier on the right. This is actually a chassis originally from a B-type bus. This is B816, originally a LGOC double-deck bus, which the enterprising Parsons brothers of Winterslow and District Motor Services have taken on and equipped with some sort of slightly eccentric body. I still can't quite work out how the driver actually sees out of the windows on a difficult day. But it's nice to kind of see that process of vehicles been shaken down from London out into the provinces in the 20s. And significantly, this one is actually parked not in the marketplace, but in what used to be called the Pig Market, in the New Canal in Salisbury, where long after the era that we're looking at was over, country buses, taxis going out to country districts always drop and pick up their passengers. That's the Roebuck Inn behind. Let's just move on through. So we're beginning to get up to kind of the story with which I suspect many of you are much more familiar than I am. Wilts and Dorset first started running a service just before the First World War. Edmund Coombs, who then went off to war and lost his place in the company, and comes back and sets up a rival company. But eventually, Wilson Dorset Motor Services demonstrates that kind of entrepreneurial flair, which the man from Motor Traction was describing as being so absent. And this is a McCurd chassis. It was used by Wilson Dorset from 1916 to 1926. It was their first bus to be painted red. It's got a brush body, I believe, with perimeter seating inside for 26. And essentially, what happens is that as the kind of carrier's mode is progressively dropped, and companies like Wilson Dorset replace it by a combination of three things in their business, really. Services through the city services, the expanding military market on the plain, and then kind of longer distance bus services to places not so well served by the train, Bournemouth, Southampton, Trowbridge, and the sort of neighbouring towns. And this is the first double-deck bus acquired, a brush-bodied AEC YC, 1919, acquired by Wilson Dorset. I wonder what the trip to Mars was that the picture has in 1919. The kind of classic set piece photograph of the early bus in action, and this is on a kind of a kind of local service out to Wilton and back, which was a number 2. Amesbury was number 1, and number 2 was their service to Wilton, which is only 3 or 4 miles from Salisbury. Meanwhile, and the operators, many of the carriers operators or bus operators, found good business. They could mix in with other things that they did with their vehicle in the week. The charabanc outing becomes the big thing in the 20s. It's a kind of short and kind of golden era for these vehicles, which we love telling with our Leyland charabanc, currently just being restored at Acton. Here's the classic charabanc picture. You assembled in the morning here, actually, also in the pig market in the New Canal, which was where they all seemed to depart from. You had your photograph taken by Whitfield Cosser, the Salisbury photographer. And by the time you returned in the evening, he had the postcards ready to sell to you as a souvenir of your day for sixpence. And there's a whole genre of these photographs, which is almost is the best record of that charabanc era. And here, actually, in the 70s, are all the country buses which have survived and of the advance of Wilson Dorset, and which are operating small-scale coaching services on the weekends and in and out of Salisbury on market days, all lined up in the New Canal. And if you go there today, you still see that's where the country buses go from. So it's a long tradition that goes back to the carriers era. And Salisbury bus station itself was built, indeed, next to the Woolpack Inn, which was a big carrier's destination in the 19th century, when it was built in the 50s. No, it's not the 50s. It built in the 30s. Now being redeveloped for homes, unfortunately. But it is conveniently next to the Woolpack for the last bus home to Salisbury Plain for the soldiers who'd had one too many in the Woolpack next door. So by the 30s, the carrier's van is very absent from the marketplace in Salisbury. The bus has overtaken the country carrier. That role is not needed any longer. And indeed, even the market had disappeared from the centre of town by 1952. This is actually my grandfather's shop. My mother remembers coming to Salisbury as a pharmacist in 1949, and the cattle were still driven through the streets. And it's a rather marvellous letter. Mr. Coombs of Fovant complained to the council in Salisbury in 1936 that due to the dense motor traffic in Salisbury, it was really difficult to drive 70 head of cattle to market through the traffic and into the marketplace. So the market moved out in 1952. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the hidden story of the country carrier. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, very much indeed. Members of the museum friends will be familiar with the way we work it now. There is a microphone, please, if you've got a question, as I hope some of you will have. Wait for the microphone, because that makes it easier for everybody in the room to hear, but also enables our YouTube viewers to hear as well. So who has a question? One at the front here I see, and then I see John's hand at the back. Right. Yep.
Well, thanks very much, Sam. A really fascinating talk about a very interesting period of transition, particularly towards the end. What if you'd like to say something a little bit about what happened to the transit of goods? Because we talked a bit about how motor buses came along and regularised the services. What happened to the people who were taking their goods to market and buying stuff?
Yeah, my understanding is that they increasingly use the railways, and the carriers act as feeders into the railways. But also, I think in the 20s and the 30s, the rise of commercial dairies and kind of agricultural produce cooperatives is increasingly the route by which country produce is sold on. Obviously, not the odd basket of turnips that we've seen, but I think that whole the market is a place where livestock and fruit and veg are sold in quantity ebbs away during the 20s and 30s. As a result of those two developments. That's my understanding. And then the stall market, which is now a big feature in the town on a Tuesday and Saturday, rises again in the 50s and 60s.
Okay, John, right at the back.
That's absolutely fascinating, Sam. I hope the next time you're giving a lecture in this theatre you won't be blasted, but leaving that out aside, I see a lot of similarities between some work that I've been contemplating for a long time in the Northeast. Like you, I noticed in the works of Dickens the role of the carrier in 1800s life. And with my interest in the railways of the Northeast, and also something that happened when I went to university in Leeds in the 1960s, which was a publication in successive years of the Jack Report on rural bus services, which basically concluded you were never going to make a profit from them, and the Traffic in Towns report of Buchanan, which always struck me as odd that it didn't say very much about where all this traffic that was predicted was coming from. And of course, if you look at what the common carriers were doing in the 1800s, they were congesting the market towns in exactly the same way as the motor vehicle became to congest them. And as I look at it now, after a career essentially as a transport planner, I see echoes coming back. We're now looking at solutions which will be computer-based, depend on very fast calculations, but essentially the solution to the rural transport problem must be something like the common carrier. Mm. The thing that particularly fascinates me, though, is how much do you think that the industrial areas of the country, such as the Northeast, where there were nonetheless quite a few perhaps larger scale carriers, fed into the railways. How much do you think that the railways missed the opportunity of integrating transport in the sense that we know it today?
I think the country carrier is a feature of market towns, less so of industrial cities, I think, but I'm sure you could find exceptions to that rule if you looked at the trade directories for some of the places you're interested in the northeast. And despite the incredible pervasiveness of branch lines, at the railways, greatest extent, they were still more expensive than the carrier or the local bus service, and less convenient because you had to take something to the station rather than take it into market or bring it home again. So you may be right. A number of bus companies, of course, a number of railway companies began to operate feeder bus services. Our own Sherabang was used as a feeder under North Western Railway in North Wales after the First World War. There must be more expertise in the audience about that particular issue than I've got, John, I think.
Okay, Peter, I've seen, and then the gentleman in the middle afterwards.
Thanks. Peter White, Omnibus Society. I originally come from Lincolnshire and did some work on the history of bus services there many years ago, which has obvious parallels with what you've described. One could use Kelly's directory to map the catchment areas of the market towns in the same way, see the carriers shifting to motor buses. But one thing I noticed was that in some areas the bus networks really focused on the same market towns as the carriers. In other areas, new urban areas had developed under the railways, and they became the focus of the bus service rather than the nearby market town. So the resort of Skegness replaced the market town of Wainfleet, just a few miles inland from the coast. The iron and steel town of Scunthorpe became the focus of services in the northwest, replacing some minor market towns. Now, I was wondering whether there might be any parallels in this case. For example, did the catchment area of Swindon enlarge as it perhaps became a focal point of bus services over a greater distance?
It might have done in terms of bus services, but to be honest, Peter, that's not wasn't what I was looking at particularly. When you look at Swindon in the 1880s, 1890s, it has quite a small catchment area of carriers services as opposed to bus services. I guess the economics of the small bus operator open up different places and different types of market to the one which the carriers had originally. I'm with you. I think that early period, sort of entrepreneurial period, where you see motor bus services being tried and stretched out into an unknown hinterland, I think it's kind of really interesting and very entrepreneurial. And then you gradually see that kind of accretion of the bigger players, certainly in Wiltshire, Hampton Dorset and Wilton Dorset. And yet there's always space in between those big operators for particularly coach operators who were based out in the villages, who are doing leisure trips on the weekend to the beach at Bournemouth or to Stonehenge or wherever. Eventually, school contracts are often more interesting to the smaller operator than they are to the big players like Wilton Dorset, who are more interested in running a regular town bus service than a kind of awkward twice a day affair. But it'd be very interesting to see that kind of replacement that you describe in Lincolnshire, because the network's kind of moving. It's maybe only the bus that enables them to shift that way. But I guess big places like Skegness and Scunthorpe are actually inevitably going to replace previous market centres with the rise of manufactured goods, packeted groceries and mass-produced clothing and so forth, which the small places you really couldn't compete with.
Thank you for a fascinating talk covering an area of transport history that I was completely oblivious about until this evening. Now, you've explained how when the carrier vans were replaced by motor buses, the passenger side of the business and the freight and parcel side of the business diverged effectively. But I was wondering, to what extent did the bus operators try to hang on to the other part of the business? I had a summer job with Ulsterbus in the early 90s and was amazed that Ulsterbus Parcels was a big bit of their business, where unaccompanied parcels were transported by bus drivers in the luggage bins. How widespread was that sort of thing, and does anything of that nature still survive today?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. It would be interesting to look at, there's that great definitive history of Wilts and Dorset buses by Colin Morris. I will look for that, because that's a good point. My understanding is that the two sort of diverge quite rapidly as purpose-built vehicles are invested in. And for a purpose-built vehicle, you want to run in and out of your village, 4 times a day, rather than wait around in the marketplace for the parcels to arrive in the middle of the day, which is where that divergence seems to lead the traditional carrier into a bit of a dead end, I think.
I can certainly remember travelling on buses not that long ago in Scotland, especially, where newspapers were still delivered by bus, and often the driver used to throw the newspapers out without stopping, and often collected then by a dog who'd come running out from the house and pick up the newspaper. Right, any more?
And of course, there's the tradition of post buses as well, which Scotland, Switzerland, and other outlying areas.
Yeah, right.
Thanks very much. I worked on the East Kent for 3 years as a summer conductor, and they had a very thriving parcel service. They had a network of agents. So I can recall on one occasion, for example, on the run from Rye to Ashford, in Appledore, there was I think the agent was the local pub, and they came out with a parcel of meat to be dropped off with Mrs. So-and-so down the road, who was waiting at a gate at the bottom of the road. And we had another one where I used to, on the way from Rye to Canterbury, after Ashford, you picked up a parcel of mushrooms to go to Herne Bay, which you handed in at Canterbury, and they got passed on to a Herne Bay bus there. So there's plenty of it around. And going back to the one about newspapers, I was out in the west of Ireland and went into a shop and asked if they had a telegraph, and they said, no, it'll be in on the bus at 2 o'clock. So I watched for the CIE bus to come around and walked in the shop, and yes, there it was. They had one copy there.
Thanks. Yeah, it would be interesting to look for the kind of continuation of the parcels traffic. I don't know whether Wilts and Dorset did it, but I'll have a look. Thanks.
Are there any other comments or questions?
Just to add on the parcel front, it was very, very common. I think it was deregulation that really killed it off. Firms like Crosville, Eastern Counties had very extensive parcel services. There'd be an agent in virtually every village. So it carried on, and it was really, as I say, deregulation, the splitting of the companies, the small firms taking over, that killed it off. I don't think it's ever going to come back somehow.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? Oh, we just squeezed in it. Kim?
Yeah, I know we are slightly sort of gradually going off topic from Salisbury, but yeah, just to close, I think, it is worth, we all should remember that, of course, London Transport, country buses, have an extensive parcel system, which has never seemed to have really had a history written on how it worked. I don't know how it worked, but yeah, parcels by bus were certainly a lot closer to home than just in the provincial areas. Thank you.
Well, there's a research topic for somebody looking for somebody to keep them occupied for a year or two. Yeah.
One in the middle at the end of the road, Jim?
Thank you. Very, very interesting talk indeed. In Cyprus, I think village buses still exist. Buses come in from the villages up in the mountains in the morning, bring the produce in, sell it, and go back in the evening. Even today.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Are we all done? I'll end with a flippant one. I think an excellent selection of images, Sam, as well as what you actually told us. But I was struck by nobody seemed to be smiling on any of the photographs. Was it because life was so tough that you just didn't smile? Was it because they're all afraid of photography? Or they all look very glum?
Yes, nobody smiles in photographs until the digital era, I think. It's a serious business, going on a Charabang outing. And
Perhaps they were smiling when they came back.
Yeah.
Okay, if we've done. Two separate messages, one to our guests from the Omnibus Society. As you leave, there are some leaflets about the Friends, if you're not already a member. I know some people are members of both. And there's also a sample copy of the Friends magazine. I brought them up. They're quite heavy. Please take one as you go out, because I don't want to take them home. A reminder to Friends that we have this sort of joint meeting, dual meeting in December, the annual members meeting to start with, and then a talk by John Willis. If you're not able to come to the annual members meeting, and we are very keen to use that as a means of getting feedback on how we run the Friends, you will be able to watch on YouTube. There'll be a link on that which will let you know about. And if you can't cope with YouTube, can't come to the meeting, if you'd like to submit a question, we'll give you an email address to do that ahead of the meeting, and we'll try to answer some of those at the meeting when we come to it. Right, but finally, and most importantly, our thanks to Sam for shining a light. Oh.
Thank you. Thank you.
Spontaneous. You don't need my run up to it. I was going to say for shining a light on an area of transport, time-wise and geographically, that I don't think has attracted much attention of the transport historian. It may have attracted the attention of the novel writers, but not the transport historian. So it has been fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Everybody have a safe journey home.
Thank you, Barry. Actually, there's a great couple of, actually 3 little publications by a man called Roger Grimley.
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, yes.
Which are all called Chalk in the Radiator, which, of course, is a pun on the Chalk Valley. Lots of
24
yeah.
books on the smaller operator.
Yeah, I quarried that quite hard, actually. It was very useful.